Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. And today we're looking into a story you probably haven't heard before.
Yeah, this is one that's pretty fascinating.
It is, it is. So we're diving into the whole story of this guy, Melchizedek.
Okay?
And we're looking at this from a bunch of different sources, trying to get the whole picture.
Right. And I think what's most interesting is the whole concept of, Machiventa Melchizedek right from the start is that he's what's referred to as an emergency son,
Yeah,
a Melchizedek that appears on a planet that is in deep trouble, and they're kind of like a cosmic troubleshooter for spiritual crisis across the universe.
that's really cool. So this particular deep dive is about his mission on our planet Urantia.
Correct.
And he took this extraordinary step of incarnating as a human,
That's right.
which is apparently a pretty rare thing.
Very, very rare. In fact, the material suggests it's only happened a handful of times in our entire local universe.
Wow.
So yeah, it's an extraordinary story.
That's a huge deal.
Yeah.
So the timeline for this is about 3000 BC, give or take.
About 3000 BC, yeah.
So we're going way, way back.
Back when the concept of God was becoming pretty unclear to humanity.
Right, right. So, okay, so let's go back to the beginning here. What was the specific situation that required this pretty remarkable intervention?
Well, the material refers to it as the miscarriage of the Adamic mission,
Right.
and that's a whole other story. But essentially what that means is there was a previous attempt at planetary upliftment that didn't go quite as planned,
Okay.
and as a result, the light of truth was dimming on Urantia.
So were there, like, people who noticed that this was happening?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the 12 Melchizedek receivers who had been placed in charge of the planet,
Right. Yep.
after a previous disruption were deeply concerned by this.
Okay.
They appealed to higher authorities.
And did they get any help?
They did not.
Okay.
They were told that the affairs of Urantia were entirely in their jurisdiction.
Wow.
Even when they appealed to a higher Melchizedek, they were simply told to uphold the truth to the best of their ability until a bestowed son arrived at some point in the future.
So they were really on their own.
Very much so.
And so it was in this context that Machiventa decided to volunteer to incarnate on Earth.
Yes, exactly. And to really bring it home, he decided to do this as a temporary human, which is a really big deal for a being of his stature.
So how does that even happen? Like, what were the mechanics of all this?
Well, permission had to be granted by the authorities on Solvington, which is, kind of like the capital world of our local universe.
Oh, okay.
And he materialized near what would eventually become Salem in Palestine.
Okay.
And all this was done with the cooperation of life carriers, master physical controllers, and a number of other celestial beings.
So a real team effort.
Very much so. But what's interesting is his arrival was actually pretty unspectacular.
Really?
No human witnesses at first.
So how did he even make himself known?
Well, he was first encountered by a Chaldean herder named Amdon. And just imagine one day a stranger appears near your camp and says, "I am Melchizedek, priest of El Elyon, the Most High, the one and only God."
That would get your attention.
Yeah, I think so.
I think so.
And from there, Amdon invited him to share a meal. And it's interesting, this was actually the first time in Machiventa's entire existence that he partook of material food.
Wow.
And that night, under the stars, Melchizedek began his mission.
What did that look like?
He revealed to Amdon that El Elyon is the creator of the cosmos, including our world and the supreme God of heaven. And that was really the start of him reintroducing the idea of one God.
And so from this kind of quiet beginning, a community starts to form around him.
That's right. Over the next few years, he attracted students and believers, and eventually they formed the community of Salem.
Okay.
And he became known throughout Palestine as the priest of El Elyon and the sage of Salem, even the sheik or king of Salem by some.
And this is the same Salem that would later become Jerusalem, right?
That's right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay.
After Melchizedek left, it eventually became Jebus, and then later the Jerusalem we know from history.
So what about Machiventa himself? What did he actually look like?
Well, he's described as being very much like the Nodites and Sumerians who lived in that region at the time.
Okay.
Almost 6 feet tall, he was a commanding figure.
Okay.
He spoke several languages, including Chaldean, which was kind of the common tongue in the area.
Okay.
His clothing was similar to what the Canaanite priests wore, but he had a very distinctive emblem, 3 concentric circles that he wore on his chest.
Oh, interesting. 3 concentric circles. What's that all about?
That was the Satania symbol of the Paradise Trinity.
Okay.
And it's interesting because his followers held that symbol in such reverence that they never used it themselves.
Oh, wow.
And over the generations, the true meaning of the symbol was lost.
So how did he live his life? Does he like a normal human being in every way?
He lived much like the humans of the time, but there were some key differences.
Hmm.
For example, he never married and he couldn't have had children.
Oh,
His physical form was specially created, kind of similar to those used by Caligastius' staff back in the day,
Right.
but it didn't contain human life plasm.
Oh, okay.
And of course, access to the Tree of Life, which existed long ago, wasn't available anymore.
Right.
So he actually had a finite lifespan.
So he wasn't immoral.
Not in that form.
Okay.
In fact, if he'd stayed too long, his physical body would have started to break down.
Oh, wow.
He ended up concluding his mission after 94 years.
Wow. Okay, so that's a good long time.
It is, yeah.
So what about his connection to the divine? Did he still have all of his spiritual capabilities?
Well, one really interesting thing is that this particular Melchizedek received a thought adjuster,
Okay.
which is a fragment of the universal father,
Right.
and it took up residence within his superhuman personality.
Oh, wow.
And that was actually a very unique event. It
Okay.
was the only time a thought adjuster has functioned within two distinct types of minds on Urantia, both divine and human.
Oh, that's really interesting. So what about other celestial beings? Was he able to communicate with them?
Well, his communication was limited while he was incarnated.
Okay.
He stayed in full contact with the other 11 Melchizedek receivers who were also on the planet in spirit form, but he couldn't communicate with other types of superhuman intelligences, so essentially he had no more contact with them than any other human being.
Okay, so how did he go about reestablishing this concept of one God? What was his method?
Well, he established schools at Salem, and these schools were actually organized based on the system used by the early Sethite priests from the Second Garden of Eden.
Oh, wow.
And it's interesting because even the practice of tithing, which was adopted later by Abraham, actually had its roots in these ancient Sethite traditions.
Oh, that's cool. So what was the fundamental message that he was trying to get across?
The core message was the existence of one God, a universal deity, but he very wisely allowed people to connect this with the constellation father of Norlidek, whom he called Elion the Most High.
Okay.
And he didn't really focus so much on the rebellion of Lucifer or the situation on Jerusalem.
Okay.
The emphasis was always on this singular supreme God.
Okay, so back to that symbol that he wore, the three concentric circles. Did he ever explain that to his followers?
He did, but primarily to his more advanced students.
Okay.
The general understanding among the people was that it represented the three realms of humans, angels, and God.
Okay.
But the true meaning was much deeper. It was the infinity, eternity, and universality of the Paradise Trinity.
Oh, wow.
Even Abraham initially interpreted it as representing the three most highs of Adentia.
Oh, wow. Okay, so he kind of taught at different levels depending on where people were at.
That's right, exactly. For
Yeah.
the general population, he emphasized the authority of the most highs of Adentia, but for a select few, he shared much deeper truths about the local universe, the super universe, even Havona.
Wow.
One example of this is his disciple Norden the Canaanite, who was exceptionally gifted and actually received some really profound teaching from Melchizedek.
So it sounds like he was planting seeds of deeper understanding within a small group?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Another good example is the family of Catro, who he actually lived with for over 3 decades.
Wow.
And they were privy to many of these deeper truths, and they preserved and passed those down through their lineage, and they actually even influenced Moses many centuries later.
Oh, that's so cool.
So yeah, it was a real long-term impact.
So what was the overall objective of all these teachings?
His goal was to instill this idea of one God, a
Right.
universe deity, a heavenly creator, a divine father.
Okay.
And this was to inspire genuine adoration and prepare humanity for the eventual arrival of Michael the son of this same universal father.
And he even hinted at a future bestowal, didn't he?
He did.
Okay.
He taught that another son of God would appear in human form, born of a woman, just as he had appeared in a materialized body.
Wow.
And, this prophecy later contributed to the belief that Jesus was a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek, signifying a divine connection to this earlier teacher.
Right. Right. That's interesting. Okay, so let's talk about the religion that formed in Salem. What were the beliefs and practices of this new religion?
The Salem worship involved very simple ceremonies.
Okay.
The followers were expected to memorize and adhere to a belief in El Elyon as the one universal Father and Creator.
Okay.
They accepted the Melchizedek covenant, which stressed that God's favor is granted through faith, not sacrifice.
Okay.
And they pledged to uphold 7 commandments and to share the news of this covenant.
So that idea that, God's favor is given freely through faith, how did that go over with people at that time?
It was a really difficult concept for them to grasp.
Really?
Yeah, they were so used to the idea that they owed debts to the gods and that, they had to make sacrifices to appease them.
Right.
This idea of getting divine acceptance freely through faith was a totally radical idea.
Wow.
And even Abraham himself initially struggled to fully embrace this.
Oh, okay. So you said there were 7 commandments. What were they?
Well, the commandments, as they're outlined, are pretty basic moral principles that you'll find in a lot of places throughout history.
Okay.
You shall not have other gods before El Elyon.
Okay.
You shall not doubt that faith is the saving grace of eternal survival.
Okay.
You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor.
Okay.
You shall not take human life. You
Okay.
shall not steal.
Okay.
You shall not commit adultery.
Okay.
And you shall not show disrespect for your parents or elders.
Okay. So that's like a whole moral framework.
It is, yeah.
So what about sacrifice, like animal sacrifice, human sacrifice? How did that fit in?
Well, it was strictly forbidden within the Salem community itself.
Okay.
But Melchizedek did wisely introduce a substitute, a
Okay.
sacrament of bread and wine.
Right.
And this was meant to replace the practice of flesh and blood sacrifice.
Okay.
But even with this, there was still this tendency among the people, even Abraham himself occasionally, to revert to those older rituals.
Yeah, habits are hard to break.
They really are.
So what was Melchizedek's main focus during this time? Was he trying to reform society in other ways too, or was it mainly spiritual?
His sources really emphasize that he stayed focused on his core mission, which was preserving the truth of one God and preparing the way for the Paradise Son.
Okay.
He deliberately avoided getting involved in social or scientific reforms.
Okay.
His efforts were entirely directed toward establishing this new spiritual understanding.
So Abraham kind of emerges as a key player in all this. How did he first come into contact with Melchizedek and his teachings?
Well, he visited the Salem school on 3 separate occasions.
Okay.
And eventually he became a very devoted convert, one of Melchizedek's most significant disciples and supporters.
Okay.
And, while it's not really accurate to talk about chosen people in a universal sense,
Right.
Abraham was definitely a chosen individual in a sense.
Right.
He was given this crucial role of keeping the truth of one God alive for future generations.
So why Palestine? Like, why was that chosen as the location for Melchizedek's mission?
Well, there were a few factors involved.
Okay.
They wanted to connect with a human lineage that demonstrated potential for leadership.
Okay.
And they had observed Abraham's ancestors and thought that his generation showed a lot of promise in terms of intelligence and sincerity.
Oh, interesting.
Also, Palestine geographically was in a very strategic location,
Okay.
kind of centrally located for future events, including Michael's eventual bestowal.
Okay.
So it was a very deliberate choice.
So what was the reaction of Abraham's family to these new teachings?
Well, his father, Terah, and the entire family were initially only half-hearted converts,
Oh,
They learned about Melchizedek's teachings back in Chaldea, but they were slow to really embrace it.
right.
And even after they arrived in Palestine, they continued to cling to some of their old Mesopotamian deities.
Oh, wow. Okay, so how did Abraham eventually end up settling near Salem?
Well, after Abraham's father died, Melchizedek invited both Abraham and his brother Nahor to come and live near Salem.
Okay.
And while Nahor chose to stay back in Haran, Abraham decided to go along with his nephew Lot. And they settled in this hilly region not far from Salem, a location that provided some natural defenses.
Okay, and so Abraham's time there wasn't just about spiritual matters, right? He had some more worldly experiences too.
Yeah, that's true. He actually took a short trip down to Egypt.
Okay.
And during that time, he served as a military commander.
Really?
And he was actually very successful.
Wow.
But despite, all the honors and recognition he received, his real commitment was to Melchizedek's spiritual work, and eventually he returned to Salem.
Okay, so it sounds like he had some initial ambitions that were a little bit more focused on earthly power.
He did.
Okay.
He wanted to be a king, and he even came up with a plan to subdue Canaan, but Melchizedek didn't approve of this.
Oh?
And because of this difference in vision, they ended up having this friendly separation.
Okay.
And Abraham moved to Hebron to establish his own military headquarters.
So even in Hebron, though, his connection to Melchizedek still gave him some advantages, didn't it?
Absolutely. The surrounding kings held Melchizedek in very high regard.
Right.
And as a result, they were in awe of Abraham and even a little bit afraid of him.
Right, because of that connection.
Right.
Okay.
So this allowed him to intervene in some regional conflicts, most notably when he rescued his nephew Lot.
Okay.
And he even led this confederation of allied tribes, and he always insisted on tithing a portion of his spoils to Melchizedek.
So he was really on his way to establishing a pretty significant earthly power.
He was.
Okay.
But Melchizedek had other plans.
So how did Melchizedek get him to kind of redirect his focus back to the spiritual?
Well, he persuaded him to give up his material ambitions and focus on something much more important.
Okay.
The spiritual concept of the kingdom of heaven.
Okay.
He helped Abraham to see how ultimately his temporal plans were kind of pointless,
Right.
and that his spiritual legacy in preserving the truth of one God was the most important thing.
And that led to the formal covenant that they made.
Yes, the covenant was established at Salem,
Okay.
and it really marked a turning point in how people understood salvation.
Okay.
Up until then, it was all about works and rituals, but now it was this revolutionary concept of salvation through faith, a direct relationship with God based on belief.
Okay.
God made the promises,
Okay.
and all humanity had to do is believe and follow.
Okay, so the birth of Isaac is connected to this covenant.
Yes, it was seen as a direct fulfillment of the promise made in the covenant.
Okay.
Abraham took his commitment very seriously. He formally accepted the covenant in a written agreement,
Okay.
and he even changed his name from Abram to Abraham as a symbol of this new relationship.
Oh, okay.
He also accepted the practice of circumcision as a physical sign of his ratification.
And there's this mention of celestial beings appearing to him around this time?
Yes, that's right after Abraham decided to give up his worldly ambitions, three celestial beings appeared to him.
Okay.
And our sources are careful to distinguish this event from the later legends about Sodom and Gomorrah, although the stories have sometimes become mixed up in the retelling.
Okay, so after this kind of turning point, a renewed partnership emerges between Abraham and Melchizedek.
Exactly. Abraham resumed his role of leadership in Salem, both civil and military.
Okay.
And Salem grew and prospered under his guidance.
Okay.
He oversaw improvements to the temple and the school.
Okay.
He further developed the tithing system.
Okay.
And he actively supported missionary work.
So these missionaries, they were pretty active in spreading the word.
They were. Salem missionaries went to many parts of the ancient world, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Asia Minor, even as far as Europe and Asia,
Wow.
carrying this message of belief and faith in the one true God.
That's pretty impressive.
It is, yeah.
Okay, so it sounds like despite all that, the long-term impact outside Palestine was limited.
Well, it was a massive task.
Yeah.
And a lot of the surrounding cultures were really resistant to abandoning their polytheistic beliefs.
Right.
So while the Salem gospel found some acceptance, the core concept of one universal God rarely took hold.
It must have been really hard to maintain that purity of understanding back then,
It was very difficult.
especially without widespread literacy
Exactly.
and ways of communicating.
It was just this constant tendency to reinterpret things through the lens of existing beliefs.
Right.
And even to mix in magical practices.
Right. So Melchizedek eventually decides to end his mission on Earth. Why was that?
There were a couple of key reasons.
Okay.
One big one was that people were starting to see him as a demigod,
Oh.
a supernatural being to be worshipped rather than as a teacher.
Oh, wow.
He wanted to solidify this truth of one God before Abraham died.
Right?
He knew that the concept was still fragile.
Okay.
So he made the decision to leave.
And how did that happen?
It was actually very simple. He went to his tent one evening in Salem, and the next morning he was gone.
Wow.
The other Melchizedek receivers had taken him back.
So what was Abraham's reaction to all this?
It was a huge test for him.
Yeah.
Even though Melchizedek had hinted that he would depart in the same way he arrived, the community was deeply saddened.
Right.
The organized structure of the Salem community almost fell apart.
Oh, wow.
But the traditions that were established did eventually lay the groundwork for Moses' work centuries later.
Wow. Okay, so Abraham was really affected by this.
Yes, he was.
Okay.
He left Salem and moved south.
Okay.
And there's even this account of him being afraid, as seen in the story of Abimelech and Sarah.
Oh, wow. So, but he eventually went back to his mission of spreading the teachings?
He did.
Okay.
He continued to share the understanding of the one God.
Okay.
And he made converts among the Philistines.
Okay.
And he remained a leader.
Okay.
He eventually returned to Hebron, and one of his final acts was arranging a wife for Isaac from his own people,
Okay.
which ensured the continuation of their lineage and traditions.
So what about the generations that came after Abraham? Did they keep this clear understanding of Melchizedek?
It was much harder for them. Within 500 years, the whole account was seen as basically a myth.
Oh, wow.
Isaac and Joseph held onto the Salem teachings more firmly, but the broader understanding within the Hebrew traditions started to fade and get distorted.
It's amazing how stories change over time.
It really is.
So what about the Old Testament accounts of this period? Are those considered to be accurate?
Well, according to our sources, a lot of the times when the Old Testament talks about Abraham talking to God, it was actually Melchizedek.
Okay.
Later scribes and interpreters just kind of equated the two.
Right.
And similarly, when you see the angel of the Lord, that's often a reference to Melchizedek.
Oh, wow.
And there were also some revisions made to the Hebrew narratives about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph during the Babylonian captivity.
Okay.
And the tendency was to elevate their national heroes and downplay or suppress the contributions of others.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And that included a lot of the history of Melchizedek.
So the historical record has been obscured over time.
It has.
And did that have any consequences for later spiritual understanding?
Absolutely. Losing sight of Melchizedek also led to a misunderstanding of the mission of the bestowed son,
Okay.
which ultimately made it harder for people to recognize Michael when he appeared on Urantia.
But there is some recognition of Melchizedek in later writings, right?
There is
Okay.
the book of Hebrews in the New Testament actually acknowledges his importance.
Okay.
They identify him as a prefigurement of Michael,
Okay.
and they affirm Jesus as a high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek.
Okay.
This recognition even extended to Christ receiving provisional authority over Urantia through the Melchizedek receivers.
So his influence continues to be felt even if it's not always explicitly stated.
That's right.
So what about Machiventa himself? What happened to him after he left Earth?
Well, he went straight back to his 11 associate Melchizedek receivers
Okay.
and resumed his duties as one of the planetary receivers of Urantia.
Okay.
He left just as quickly and quietly as he'd arrived.
And he continued to take an interest in the planet and his followers.
He did.
Okay.
He remained interested in the descendants of those who had embraced his teachings,
Okay.
especially the lineage through Isaac, which intermarried with the Kenite families.
Okay.
He also continued to work with various prophets and seers on Urantia in the centuries leading up to Michael's arrival.
So what's his current status?
Well, he served as a planetary receiver until Michael's bestowal.
Okay.
After that, he served on Jerusalem as one of the 24 directors.
Okay.
And more recently, he's been elevated to the position of vicegerent planetary prince of Urantia.
Wow.
Essentially, Chris Michael's personal representative
Okay.
and the acting sovereign in the absence of a resident planetary prince.
So he's got a pretty important role still.
He does.
So is there any speculation about what his ultimate destiny might be?
Well, because of the unusual nature of his bestowal as an emergency son, there's some speculation that he might permanently become the planetary prince.
Oh, wow.
Maybe taking Caligastia's place.
Oh, wow.
Or maybe just continuing as vicegerent.
Okay.
And there's even this really interesting idea that maybe one day Machiventa, Adam and Eve, and Krista Michael will all appear on Urantia simultaneously.
Wow.
Along with maybe even some other high-ranking celestial beings, which would make our planet pretty unique.
That would be something.
It really would.
Yeah, so what about his connection with humanity's spiritual journey?
Well, it's believed that Machiventa is actually going to follow the ascending mortals of Urantia all the way to paradise.
Wow.
And he even served as an invisible governor general of Urantia for almost a century, less than 1,000 years ago.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, it's possible he could return in that capacity sometime in the future.
So the story of Machiventa Melchizedek is far from over.
Absolutely not.
He really is an extraordinary figure
He is.
and played a pivotal role in shaping the religious history of our world.
Absolutely.
His mission as an emergency son,
Right,
his work in reintroducing the concept of one God,
right,
the principle of salvation by faith,
right,
his influence on Abraham,
right.
and his ongoing connection with Urantia.
Yeah, it's really amazing.
It paints this picture of a being with a truly unique and important place in our history.
You know, it's mind-blowing to consider this concept of emergency sons, these beings that step into these critical situations across the universe.
Right.
It makes you wonder about all the unseen forces that might be at work shaping not just our world, but countless others.
It really gives you a whole new perspective on things.
It does.
So as you go about your day,
Yeah.
think about the implications of Machiventa's story.
Okay.
What does it tell us about the nature of spiritual understanding?
Right.
What's the significance of these emergency sons in the grand scheme of things?
It's something to really ponder.
And if you have any questions,
Yeah.
or you want to learn more
Absolutely.
about Machiventa Melchizedek,
Yeah.
keep exploring.
Right.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time.
See you then.